Welcome everyone to our program today, Reforming Our Justice System with Shanti Brien. I'm Laurel Plemier and I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Piedmont. I want to thank you all for coming to spend some time with us this afternoon. We really appreciate it. And before we get to an introduction of the speaker and our topic, I wanted to go over a few logistics. So if you're here with us on the Zoom call, please keep yourself muted for the duration of the event, which will help minimize background noise, and it will also prevent your face from popping up on our YouTube live stream. You can post your questions for our speaker at any time during the event using the chat feature on Zoom. And you can also ask them in the Zoom live stream if you're watching on, YouTube live stream if you're watching on YouTube. And if you are with us on YouTube, please consider subscribing to our channel. And if you click the little bell, you'll get notifications of our future live stream events. And if you would like advanced notice of our events, please join our mailing list, which you can do on our website, which is www.lwvpiedmont.org. And if you're not already a member of the League, you can also join the League there. Your membership dues help support the grassroots efforts of the League, not just here in Piedmont, but in California and our national League. Our efforts in voter education and advocacy influence public policy across the country. It's extremely important work both now and for the foreseeable future. So without taking any more time, I'm going to turn things over to Julie Chang, who's one of our program committee chairs, and she will introduce today's program.
Hi, everybody. I'm happy to introduce Shanti Brien. She's written a book that just came out in March. It's called Almost Innocent, and it's about the messy, tragic, and often unjust legal system that we have here in the United States. Now I'm going to give you some of her background. She earned her BA in Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley, and then went to law school and graduated from Stanford Law. She grew up in Modesto, which is where cruising in your car began, I'm told, in the Central Valley of California. Shanti is an enrolled member of the Muskogee Creek tribe. Did I pronounce it correctly?
Yes.
Yes, okay. And she co-founded Fog Break Justice, which is a company that provides training and education. Its mission is to transform the criminal justice system. So I'm really hoping today we'll learn what we can do. Shanti. Okay, take it away.
Okay, I'm going to share my slides to get us started here. Okay, just give me a little minute to get those up. Okay, do you see the first slide? Yes, okay, great. Okay, so I am going to start today. I'm a criminal defense lawyer, and I have worked for many years, maybe about 15 years as a criminal defense attorney, but as an appellate specialist. And I like to explain it this way. When you've lost at trial and when you're facing like 87 years to life in a cement cage with a metal toilet, that's when you need me. So in my work as a criminal defense attorney, I see hope and I see resilience and I see gratitude and I see self-awareness. But mostly I lose and my clients lose. So when people hire me, they write to me often from prison on scraps of paper with nubs of pencils, hoping I can create an argument where another attorney has failed. And so the system is set up this way. Convictions are upheld and I lose. And convictions should be upheld or else the justice system would explode with retrials. So I defend a young kid who's been put away for life for being in the wrong car at the wrong time. I work really hard, and then almost always we lose. So this is somewhat of a bleak beginning to the talk today, but I'm going to share 3 stories from my book. And those stories do include resilience and the grit I mentioned before. I hope they also inspire empathy, and which I hope will create a spark for change. Criminal justice reform is what we need, to say the least, if not a complete reimagination. And after the 3 stories, I'll share some takeaways from them, from the criminal justice system, focusing on what needs to be done and what we can all do to change the system and to improve the safety for everyone in our communities and our country. Okay, so first is the story of Fatou Ferrama. I'm going to read from a portion of his story from my book. When the Ninth Circuit appointed me to represent him, I knew we would lose, like I said. From the records I received, a few faded copies of court docket sheets and denials of many appeals and even more habeas petitions, I could not have realized that saving the life of this 40-something Samoan father of 4 would be my greatest legal accomplishment. The story of how Ferrama and his family became victims of the war on drugs began when Guam agents intercepted an express mail package containing more than 200 grams of methamphetamine. They tracked the package down a long dirt road to where Ferrama lived. In exchange for the authorities leaving his wife and children alone, he admitted that the package was his and he'd received other packages of meth from California. Ferrama then led the agents around the property, showing them where he buried prior drug shipments. In 1997, a jury found Ferrama guilty of 3 counts of importation of methamphetamine from California and 3 counts of possession with intent to distribute drugs. At sentencing for those convictions, Ferrama faced mandatory minimum sentences, the policy equivalent of a death spiral leading to a supermassive black hole. It wasn't too long ago that mandatory minimums became a thing. In 1951, Congress enacted the first mandatory minimum penalty of 2 years of imprisonment for violating the Narcotic Drug Import and Export Act, which broadly prohibited drug sales and purchase. In 1986, at the height of the crack cocaine epidemic, Congress doubled down on mandatory minimums. The kingpins and the masterminds, identified by the amount of drugs they had, would now get 10 years instead of 2 to 3 in prison for their first convictions. Only 2 years later, mandatory minimums for involvement in a drug enterprise increased yet again to 10 to 20 years. We get numb to these numbers, just as Congress has, but if you think about spending 1 month in prison, or having your son or husband spend 1 month in prison, the absolute loss of freedom and home and anything resembling comfort, and the ridiculous fear that would engender. The idea of 1 year or 10 years or 20 years for your first offense becomes all the more stark. Still, Ferrama, quite possibly the antithesis of a mastermind, felt the brunt of these sentencing policies. Ferrama received 4 life sentences plus 30 years to run concurrently. 4 life sentences plus 40 years. He was shipped to a federal prison on the mainland, 6,000 miles away. He found me after 10 years of appeals and handwritten habeas petitions. Since his convictions, the Ninth Circuit had changed course and ruled that it was no longer a crime to import drugs from California to Guam because Guam is a US territory. All of a sudden, 3 of his 6 convictions were no longer crimes. Yet, At oral argument in the Ninth Circuit, one judge just hammered me with the anger he felt toward my client and other criminals like him. The judge said, "I don't see any manifest injustice here. He has a mandatory life sentence. It's troubling to read the history of this case and all the habeas petitions he has filed. This guy was dealing methamphetamine. The injustice here is to the judicial system that put up with repeated efforts by the defendant over what appears to be nothing." Then he made it personal, which includes the time you might have better spent representing someone who was a real victim of injustice. I stood with one hand gripping the podium. The judge seemed to be implying that I was personally abusing the judicial system by zealously advocating for my client, a client the Ninth Circuit appointed me to represent. But then Judge Betty Binns Fletcher stepped in. She had been appointed by President Carter and was known as the lioness of liberalism. "You know, Judge Foreman raised a very good point," she said. "Why waste all of this judicial time on a case like Ferrama's? If the government had just said, yeah, we'll wipe out those 3 counts, we would have all gone home. End of story." I wished I could be that tiny, white-haired, bespectacled powerhouse, because just like that, it was over. In one sentence, Betty Binns Fletcher turned Judge Foreman's whole argument back around at him. He, like so many people, including a surprising number who corner me at cocktail parties, just don't understand why I waste my time and energy and why the government has to waste so many resources on people like Ferrama. Criminals in federal prisons and on death row having decent, if not comfortable, lives provided by the taxpayers. But what if we thought about it in another way? Instead of criminals wasting money by constantly appealing, perhaps the government is wasting dollars by charging people with crimes and upholding convictions instead of admitting their mistakes. The government is responsible for criminalizing more and more behaviors, for prosecuting more and more crimes, for increasing sentences so that 10 years in prison is doled out as easily as a grande latte. And in this case, the government fought and fought and fought. Ferrama could not write a complete sentence, and yet he took repeated legal beatings by the government of the United States and persevered. 9 months and 6 days later, we won. He sent me this letter, and I'm going to read it to you exactly as he wrote it. "Dear Miss Brien, I received your letter with the court order and understand most of it, but must say thank you very much. There is not that much thank you in this world, and would like you to know that you have done a fine job. Anyway, I just want you to know that I have learned so much from being in prison and that crimes will not pay, because everyone will learn from their mistake. Now, all I do is tell people to stay away from drug and the crimes, because there's only 2 places that there will end up. One is prison. The other is 6 feet under, and that's not good. So every time I talk with people, I tell them I was going through is not easy when you have a family. So I will be waiting on you responded, and I will always pray that one day I can be back home with my kids." I savored Mr. Ferrama's thank you. I believed that 10 years in prison had taught him the disadvantages of crime. I believed he had learned from his mistakes. But his prayer to see his children touched my mothering core. His children probably couldn't visit him. They perhaps didn't even miss him anymore. They didn't even know him. Yet as I held out hope that Mr. Ferrama would be resentenced and see his kids again soon, I had no idea the legal chaos about to hit us. So that story continues. So the second story is the story of, and this is not, these aren't real pictures of them. They're stand-in pictures to make the stories come alive. But the next story is of Deandra Jones, and it's shorter, so hang in there. I never met Deandra Jones. We only communicated by mail, as was typical for an appellate attorney, but I connected with her instantly. She seemed like a typical mom with 2 kids. Her girls were ages 4 and 7, and I had 2 girls of my own, just a bit older. Deandra's girls had different fathers, just like my sister and me. Deandra was raising her kids in Sacramento, not far from Modesto, where I grew up. Deandra had worked for over 2 years in the accounts receivable department of a company. She was a young African-American woman with a decent, steady job. She had been arrested once over a fight at a party, but nothing had come of it. Until the day she was arrested for an armed robbery, Deandra had a clean record. Like her trial attorney said, she seemed like a regular middle-class girl, just like me, except for one night. At her trial, Deandra Jones testified in front of a jury that she did not participate in any way in the robbery of the video store. That night, she had gone to her friend Kaya's house near the video store around 7:30. Kaya was like a sister, and Deandra brought her Tylenol for her sick son. Deandra then began to feel sick herself. After leaving Kaya's house around 10:45, Deandra drove her gold Infiniti onto the highway. She turned off the freeway to throw up, and right after that, the police pulled her over. Kaya, the alibi, did not testify. After a 5-day trial, the jury just took 1 day to convict Deandra of all 5 felony counts and 1 misdemeanor. Deandra was sentenced to 7 years and 4 months in state prison. Before the trial, the district attorney had repeatedly offered Deandra 6 months in the county jail in exchange for a guilty plea. Deandra, of course, repeatedly refused. I called her attorney to ask her about the trial, her trial attorney. And she said, "Oh yeah, I remember Deandra well. It was going really well till Miss Deandra took the stand. You'll see it in the record. Actually, maybe you won't. She presented herself really well, physically, I mean. Business suit, heels, the whole thing. Looked like a middle-class girl. But then the DA played those tapes of her phone calls from jail. So ghetto, cussing and just sounding so badly." So Deandra, for a jury, this meant that Deandra sounded like a criminal. Social scientists have long demonstrated that people in our society have negative associations with African Americans as a group, and that those associations impact our behaviors without our conscious awareness. Specifically, researchers have shown that most of us associate African Americans with crime, criminality, and violence. The inverse is true too. We associate crime with Black people. For instance, there's this study when participants were primed with a Black male face just for a millisecond, they were quicker to distinguish the faint outlines of a weapon. So there were like 50 frames, and in frame 1, you'll see frame 20, and finally frame 41. But when they were primed with the Black face, they could identify the weapon much earlier, around frame 20, and it took them much longer when primed with a white face. So by implicitly thinking Black, they more quickly saw a weapon. And by implicitly thinking about weapons and violence, they more quickly identified the Black person. In another study, this one, participants were shown the dark-skinned forearm of a mass robber. So half the participants were shown the first picture and half the second picture. They were much more likely to interpret the ambiguous evidence presented in the mock criminal trial as indicative of guilt, even when they could not consciously recall the race of the defendant. So the only difference in the evidence presented were these 2 photos. For Deandra, those associations proved disastrous. Just by hearing evidence of a violent armed robbery, the jury would tend to focus on the Black face in the room, Deandra's. But by seeing Deandra, a dark-complected Black woman, sitting as the defendant, sounding ghetto, they would have been more likely to see ambiguous evidence as indicative of a crime. Although the two main pieces of evidence against Deandra had weaknesses, it would have been virtually impossible for the jury to interpret that evidence in Deandra's favor. My appeal went nowhere. The court decided that the trial attorney had done a fine job. Even if she had made some mistakes, what difference did it make? I was confused. I again asked Deandra and her mother to get me Kaya's declaration, the alibi. I told them if they didn't get it, it was over. I heard nothing. Maybe she thought she deserved her punishment. Maybe Deandra realized her minor involvement in the crime really was a crime. Maybe after several years in prison, Deandra was resigned to her fate. She was halfway through her sentence. What was the point of challenging these convictions? I was confused by these ideas. I created stories to explain Deandra and her family's disinterest in the appeal. Incarceration might have been the norm among her friends. Of course, I could see how my stories about Deandra reflected my own biases of the African American community. They were the same assumptions and stereotypes which had contributed to her conviction. I realized we weren't alike as I thought. She was Black and I was white, and that made all the difference in the criminal justice system. And so the final story is about a woman named Dorothy Carnshaw. For 18 years, she lived in a condominium complex full of young Silicon Valley types. Only she had the time to worry about the Homeowners Association and its annual meetings, officer elections, 2 bank accounts, and the statement of information filed annually with the California Secretary of State. Dorothy was like the mom who makes you wear matching outfits, the low-level manager who demands useless reports, the DMV, and she lived next door. One day, the owners had a meeting without telling her and voted her out of office. Later, Dorothy transferred money from the association account to the reserve account to satisfy a title company request for proof that the association had enough in reserves. She had been acting as secretary and treasurer. No one else was doing it. Everyone had bent the Homeowners Association rules, but who cared? When another homeowner found out, he called the police to say the money had been stolen. Turns out the police cared. The district attorney cared. But a jury didn't care. By acquitting Dorothy of the theft charge, they sent a message to the district attorney that the theft prosecution was a waste of time and resources. But 2 other charges stuck. On 2 occasions, she filed the statements of information and signed them as the secretary. And given that she was no longer an officer of the Homeowners Association at the time of the filing, because she had secretly been voted out of office, she had lied on the forms filed with the state. The jury convicted Dorothy of 2 counts of filing false instruments, 2 felonies. Dorothy, as an attorney, would lose her law license after all. I can't begin to guess how much Dorothy Carnshaw's case cost the taxpayers of California. The resources spent on the investigation, prosecution, and criminal supervision of this middle-aged mime kind of blew my mind. And for being in a homeowners association dispute, it seemed unfair and ridiculous and wasteful and unjust all at once. Dorothy could be every middle-aged woman in America. She could be your dental hygienist or your son's first grade teacher or the lawyer writing up your mortgage. She could be any of us. And now, instead of an attorney, she was a felon. It hit me that anyone could become a criminal. So what can we learn from these stories? The first is that the war on drugs is still happening. Alamalo, his conviction was in the 90s, but it's still going on. There's 1 million arrests every year for drug possession. In 2019, 500,000 people are still incarcerated for nonviolent drug offenses. That's 1 in 5 people in prison. And just the other day, I heard that there are 8 people, men in prison in Arkansas for life for marijuana-related offenses. Sentences are still very high. So about a third of people in California prison are there for life or life without parole. Deandra received 7 years for what the DA thought 6 months would be sufficient punishment. The criminal justice system weighs much more heavily upon poor, undereducated, and people of color. And most people know about this. In 2017, about 30% of California male prisoners were African American, while there are only about 5% of the state's population. There's implicit bias at every stage of the system, as we heard in Deandra's case, but starting with police and prosecutors, which we hear a lot about, but also defense attorneys and judges and jurors. In fact, one study shows that the more egalitarian you claim to be, the more bias impacts your decisions. Basically, kind of you refuse to see it in yourself. Dorothy's story also shows us that could be any of us. Our country is addicted to criminalizing behaviors and extracting plea bargains. And so the judge in Ferrama's case can easily dismiss him as a drug dealer or a bad guy or a criminal. And because of that, we saw that judge thought that Ferrama was not really entitled to any sense of fairness or judicial resources, not to mention any empathy. So there's 2 general areas of what we can do, and you as a voter and an informed community member and a compassionate person can really play a role in every suggestion I will make. The 2 areas I suggest are to make the system smaller and to make it fairer. So reduce the size. Decriminalizing drugs is a good start. Many states are reducing marijuana, but like I said, that's still happening. Eliminating cash bail would be a huge start, a huge improvement. It creates an incredible incentive to plead guilty, even if you have a good defense or you didn't commit a crime at all. Bail has an incredible damaging impact on people living in poverty and people of color. Consider the same man arrested and the same 2 men arrested and charged with the same crime. One can afford the $500 bail bond and the other cannot. The one that stays in jail, loses his job, damages his family, and will most likely plead guilty, whether or not he has done it. Addressing mental illness and addiction as a public health issue, of course, that's related to the decriminalizing drugs. This has got quite a bit of attention lately because of the sort of defunding police movement. There's a program called Cahoots in Eugene, Oregon that's been doing this for 30 years, maybe more, and it's been quite successful. And the Alameda County, I believe, is piloting this project. And in fact, I believe Piedmont's participating in that pilot project. I really challenge you to not only reconsider sentencing, but reconsider just this notion of violent crime. And by this, I mean, we're over-inclusive with the category of violence for Black and brown people, but under-inclusive, obviously, when it comes to police or aggression toward women. But in terms of just even sentencing, is a marijuana dealer who brandishes a switchblade a violent criminal? Should he get 10 years in prison? Would a year work? What about the getaway driver in an armed robbery? that would be considered a violent crime. So I challenge people to think about this. Another example, or something I'd like you to think about, is in 2017, 30% of the people that went into prison in California were there for the crime of assault. This is labeled a violent crime, yet it doesn't require physical contact or injury. So for example, threatening to hit another person, spitting on another person, throwing an object at another person are all assaults. There's a study that the Vera Institute did that increasing incarceration has marginal to zero impact, especially on violent crime. So the study was called The Prison Paradox by the Vera Institute. So the second thing we can do is to make the system more fair. Once it's much, much smaller, that doesn't mean it's going to be more fair. And so I would like people to support policies to reduce the use of race in convictions. And I know the League of Women Voters was and continues to work on this quite a bit in California and helped pass the California Racial Justice Act. And that allows people to challenge their convictions when there was race bias shown in the case, even if it wasn't intentional, which is a big change in the law. And there's a new law, AB 256, the California Racial Justice Act for All, to make these provisions retroactive. And so that's an important measure that we can support. I also call for consistent, sustained attention to systemic racism, to bias reduction, and to just increasing fairness in our system. So educating all people in all stages of the criminal justice system. And this final idea, discretion reducing mechanisms. So there's with and by unconscious bias, discretion is really a problem when people are not accountable for their decisions. There's a lot increase in bias shown in their decision making. And this is why we request that judges say the reasons for their decisions. And so closer to home, Jennifer Eberhardt is the woman that did that gun study. She's an expert at Stanford on bias, and particularly this bias against African Americans. And she's been working with the Oakland Police Department for quite some time. And she did some, I think it was a study, but maybe it's been rolled out to the whole department. She requires, or the department now requires, that every stop, vehicle or in-person stop of a person, the police officer writes down the reason for the stop in addition to their demographic data. And that one discretion elimination tool reduced the arrest of African Americans by 40%. So this is really important in policing and in prosecutors that have so much discretion. And getting like a little bit more personal, what can you do? I would say, in addition to supporting all of those policy changes that I mentioned, look at yourself, educate yourself on race, on becoming an anti-racist. Like I said, the people who strongly believe in their egalitarianism might be the most impacted by bias. So learn more about your bias. There's a little online tool called the Implicit Association Test. If you Google it, it will come right up. Millions of people have taken it. It's a quick little, almost gamified way to kind of consider your own biases. And then I challenge you to question yourself when calling the police. What is the person doing that's suspicious? To really ask yourself that rather than just relying on your gut or your first impression that might really be impacted by bias. Vote. of course. I don't need to tell this group that, but know who you're voting for, and their stances on criminal justice. And then this is, much more non-policy, but kind of in the vein of my book, which is, I really think it's important for people to connect and for us to build empathy for those impacted by the criminal justice system. So Brian Stevenson's, that should be in quotes, to get proximate, really get closer to the problem you're trying to resolve. So maybe volunteer at Mount Tamalpais College at San Quentin. They're looking for volunteers. Become a mentor for youth that might be at risk at getting involved or are involved with a diversion program. Hire formerly incarcerated people if you have that opportunity as a business owner or hiring manager. The ACLU published a report documenting the business case for hiring people who are formerly incarcerated. So you could check that out. But, know people, hear stories of the criminal justice system. Ferrama's story, Deandra's story, Dorothy's story, share those stories. That's something you can do. And make a commitment. In all my presentations, I ask that people make some small commitments. Take one of my suggestions and do what you can with what you have in the place you are and the time you have. And I think that's, I have a shameless plug for my book, which is called Almost Innocent. And it is part memoir and part stories of my clients. So it's 9 clients. You heard a snippet of 3 of them. And at this point, I would love to take questions about criminal justice reform, about what you can do, about my book, about my work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shanti. We do have some questions, and before I get to the questions, I just wanted to say about AB 256.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you getting me straight on that.
I think you had it right.
Okay.
But it's the Racial Justice Act, and the League of Women Voters of California does have an action alert concerning that bill. And if you go to our website, lwvpiedmont.org, and go to the Take Action page, you can see the action alert, and it will take you right to the page to send a letter to our representatives.
Thank you. I really encourage people to do that. It's really actually a powerful and important change. And definitely needed. I mean, how effective it might be, I think we don't know yet, because the original act just has only been in place for a few months. So we'll have to keep our eyes open for that.
So one question is, and I'm going to tag on a little bit more to it. What do you think the resistance to eliminating cash? Why is the resistance to eliminating cash bail so persistent? And what would replace it, and how would that system work?
Okay, so it's complicated, of course. I mean, number one, there's the bail industry, which, is lobbying hard to keep it in place. Number two, I think it's just change is hard for the system we've had that system for so long. I think judges and prosecutors are especially worried about it. I mean, they are elected officials, and so, they don't get a lot of good publicity when, they let people out and they commit more crimes. So I would say we're resistant to change in general, but a system like a criminal justice system is especially resistant to change. I think there's just fear, but it's really unfounded. I mean, there's something called the Bail Project, and it's Yale University is partnering with like private donors to pay people's bail. And they say they have a 90% return to court date for the people that they pay their bail with, I mean, no incentive at all, except, so this goes to the second part of the question is what can we replace it with? I mean, one of their basic measures is just reminders, like text and call reminders. There's also like social support. There's a huge amount of people that don't come back to their court dates because they just can't get transportation or can't afford transportation back to court. So there's other very small but powerful measures we can put in place to replace it. I guess I would also add that we had that bail reform measure initiative on the ballot, and it was confusing, I thought, as a voter, and I even am pretty well informed that because there were some really powerful groups, I think it was like the NAACP, that opposed it. And that was because it's often suggested that it be replaced with this like algorithm kind of where you input the information and it spits out whether this person is a danger or not. And if you really look into those, I now am in agreement that that is not a good replacement, because those are so, like, one of the measures of whether you're going to be a danger or not is if you own a home. Well, that's obviously a biased measure. I mean, another input is like, have you been arrested? Or, how many arrests? Well, that's a biased measure. So I guess in a way, I'm glad it didn't get replaced. There would be better ways to do that. That was really long-winded. Sorry.
Can you talk a little bit about the budget of the public defender versus the DA's office, and what can be done to equalize the budgets of those two offices in various counties? I guess San Francisco does have equal budgets, but Alameda County does not.
I don't know much about that issue, actually. I was recently in Louisiana talking about my book. It has a little bit on Louisiana, and they just instituted a public defender system really not that long ago. And it's chronic. It's so underfunded that they said they admitted they were providing constitutionally inadequate representation because they had so many, their caseload was so high. I know it is a big, major problem. I don't know what we can do about it except vote and, pressure our legislature to fully fund the public defender. I mean, I don't know how it's even possible that, public defenders are quite good, committed attorneys. I work with them all the time. And, it's literally impossible for them to provide more than encouragement to plea bargain, unfortunately, to get through their cases.
So if the system changed and somehow the plea bargaining were either not favored or there was just less incentive for people to accept plea bargains, wouldn't that just completely overwhelm? I mean, that's not really a viable path either, right? I mean, what is the solution?
Well, Michelle Alexander of the New Jim Crow, I don't know if you've read that, but it's very, very seminal work. The most important criminal justice book we've had, or research that's been done maybe ever, I would say, since the war on drugs, for sure. But she says that's what we should do. it would take every single defendant to put his or her own life and liberty at risk. But to say, I will not take a plea bargain, I mean, the whole system would grind to a halt. So only 3% of federal charges go to trial. It's like 5 or 6% for state charges. So like all convictions are plea bargains, I mean, essentially. And you know, people that are stuck in bail, they are stuck in jail because they can't afford bail. They have, I mean, absolutely, it seems reasonable, I think, to plead to a crime that you haven't done or you have a good defense to get out.
Yeah, I would think if you were reforming the plea bargain side of things, you would have to, in conjunction, reform the bail system.
Yeah, I mean, another thing that I would like, this is like my fantasy world, which is the plea offer. That's the maximum sentence the person can get. So if you think about Deandra, she was repeatedly offered 6 months in jail for her involvement in an armed robbery. That's what the district attorney thought was the reasonable sentence for her involvement, or the level of involvement that she could prove, right? And she got 7 years. So like if we could decrease the incentive, district attorneys wouldn't, you know, do it. There would be a lot less incentive to do that. So bail, sentencing reform, reducing the discretion of DAs, that would all really help.
Can you speak a little bit about the death penalty in the United States and what you think the future for the death penalty is? And I know there's some news recently about some changes about the death penalty in certain states.
I was really, you know, doing all I could for the initiatives that were on the ballot, like in the last, what was that, 6 years, maybe. We've had 2 different initiatives. I was quite disappointed about, you know, the results of the second one, where, you know, the voters chose to kind of reform and speed it up. I think, you know, the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice. So I feel like that is a crazy optimistic thing to say, but I think that we're bending toward that, getting rid of the death penalty. I mean, I think it's only a matter of time. I don't know what the recent news is, Laurel, that you could tell us.
I don't have specifics, but just there are some states that are doing things. I guess the lethal injection is not always viable, and they've reinstituted like the firing squad, and there was another method that I can't remember off the top of my head, but it just seems very like it's 2021 and I'm shocked.
Yeah, and so I mean, I'm hoping that you know, federal judges will be shocked by that too. I mean, I know that those are going to get tied up in the federal courts, hopefully for a long time. I mean, lethal injection has been tied up. So yeah, unfortunately, then we have this whole group of new federal judges that maybe don't agree with me, but I mean, I think it seems quite barbaric. Yeah, I did read that about the firing squad. And I just hope that, yeah, I hope, I know that there's many, many, many good lawyers that are helping on this front. Mm-hmm. And so I think that they'll keep up the good fight. Mm-hmm. I never worked on death penalties. It's a very, very subspecialty. Cliff Gardner in Piedmont does that work.
What is the process for appealing convictions for things that are now legal? like the marijuana convictions. That's similar to the what the AB 256 is talking about, but what's the current process?
To appeal, I'm sorry, can you?
So if you were convicted for something in the past, the law has changed, what you were convicted for is no longer illegal. Can you go back and appeal your conviction?
That's only if if your appeal is not, if your conviction is not final, and that means you've gone through your appeal up through the time it would take to appeal to the US Supreme Court. So if there's a change in the law before your conviction is final, then you get the benefit of the law. Otherwise, the law has to be explicitly retroactive, which is exactly what you're saying. The California Racial Justice Act that was implemented to be able to challenge your conviction based on like non-intentional racial bias, that wasn't made retroactive. And so this new bill is going to do that. And it has to be explicit in the law. So that's why it's important that we do make those things retroactive, or else it's ridiculous outcomes, right? Because there's people sitting in prison for things that are no longer crimes, which reminds us of Ferrama, who was having a hard time getting any court to really care that was the issue. So our best bet is to make those kinds of laws retroactive.
Are there any reforms that we can advocate for locally in Oakland or in Alameda County? And could a city ballot initiative that might have more traction, could that work?
No, like criminal laws are all statewide laws. I mean, yeah, in terms of policing, there's more local things that can be done. Getting involved in there's a policing committee here at the Piedmont Racial Equity Campaign has a policing committee that's quite involved in local policing. And yeah, letting Chief Bowers know, that you care about things like this CAHOOTS program, which is like diverting calls about mental illness to mental illness experts instead of to police. Like that's something you could do really hyper locally. Countywide, yeah, know who you're voting for DA, reach out and say, there's going to be, Nancy O'Malley said she was going to retire. So we're going to have a big election coming up in Alameda County for prosecutor, for her position, which is really huge. I mean, the discretion of the prosecutor makes a ton of difference in who is being charged and convicted. So that would be something to watch out for and to learn a lot about the candidates.
That is good to know. I have not heard that.
Yeah.
What can we do to reduce or remove restrictions that are placed on felons who have completed their time? Things like being barred from government subsidized housing or barred from various jobs like firefighters or emergency responders.
That just got changed, actually, the firefighter thing. I think in 2020, people who are in prison who work as firefighters can now be hired, and that there was a recent change in the law on that. So that's just being informed about criminal justice related measures that are happening. And there's no better place to do that than League of Women Voters. So you guys are in the right place. What was the other thing you mentioned? The firefighter thing, that just did change. Oh, the other
government subsidized housing.
Oh, yes. Well, that's more complicated because that's a federal issue. Hopefully Biden administration will work on that. That is a big problem, to be barred from food stamps, for instance. So if we think about Deandra, she's in prison for 7 years. She can't probably get a job because of gap in her record, and she's a felon. And now she can't get housing assistance and she can't get food stamps. So it's quite hard to rebuild your life after something like that. Not to mention, custody of her children and things like that. There was another change though in 2020 about people on parole, I think, who are released on parole, were able to vote. I think we changed that last year.
Yeah.
And so that impacted, I think it was like 15,000 people, something like that. So that's a good change. I mean, just stay informed, stay on top of what is happening statewide.
So we only have about 5 minutes left. I wanted to ask you to speak a little bit about what Fog Break does, what their mission is, and the kind of work that they do.
Oh, thank you for asking. Yeah, so Fog Break Justice is my organization. Basically, I got very disheartened with my work, losing all the cases I lost in the face of injustice. And I just, I thought I would take a sabbatical, and I started doing some teaching. And then I got together with some other teachers and educators. And our theory is that in the life of a criminal case, I was working down here, the like Ninth Circuit, the step below the Supreme Court. And if we could change the bias, if we could increase fairness at the very beginning, which is the community member police interaction, if we could make that more fair, we could prevent all the bias compounding on each other throughout the system. So that's where we really started, was as educating police on reducing bias, increasing community trust, just being more fair. And our work has expanded greatly to all people in the criminal justice system. We are increasingly working with district attorneys, but we work with public defenders and judges and probation officers to be more fair. We do a lot of teaching on race and systemic racism and the interplay and relationship of the criminal justice system with race. So it's mostly education, but we do all kinds of consulting and data collection for those kinds of agencies. Yeah, it's great to have partners. Like as an appellate attorney, it was a very lonely existence. And so it's been a way that I feel like I can make a little bit more impact on a greater number of people.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your taking the time to talk with us today. This was great and very informative. And I also wanted to thank Julie again and the rest of the program committee for all of your work in organizing and promoting this event.
Yeah, thank you guys very much for having me. It's really just my honor. I'm a member and I really appreciate the work of the League. So thank you for having me. And yeah, I'm open to answer a few more questions if people want to stay around. If not, I'm a tired Tuesday woman. But happy to just.
I think we answered all the questions that were in the chat. Good. Although if I missed any,
yeah, if you missed
pipe up
any.
now. Yeah,
Okay,
pipe up now if I missed any.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to stop the live stream.
Okay.